Hey everybody, Mark Dawes here, and the other day I put out a video about supervision in the gym, and in that video I talked about the importance of risk assessments, particularly a risk assessment being the hub of everything you do, where everything else comes from. But I also mentioned in that video about a risk assessment being done to a suitable and sufficient standard by a suitably qualified or competent person with sufficient experience in that field. And that's prompted a number of emails come in and a few comments about people asking, what does suitable and sufficient actually mean, and who actually assesses that? Well, to start with the second part of the question first, if you're being assessed on it, then that will be by an inspector who will come out because there's been a problem, and he will look at your risk assessments and actually decide whether or not they've been done to a suitable and sufficient standard by a properly qualified and competent person with enough experience. But the next thing I'm going to show you now is an extract from our online course, our online Level 3 risk assessment course, which explains what suitable and sufficient means. So without any ado, I'll just run into the clip now. Have a look at it. It does mention a download there. You can get the download from the TUC website if you want it. But enjoy the clip, and I'll meet you on the other side. Okay, we're now going to look at the issue of suitable and sufficient, because what the law says on assessing risk, and this is taken straight from the HSE website at www.hse.gov.uk, it says the law states that a risk assessment must be suitable and sufficient, i.e. it should show that a proper check was made, you asked who might be affected, you dealt with all the obvious significant risks, taking into account the number of people who could be involved. The precautions are reasonable and the remaining risk is low. You involved your workers or their representatives in the process. And the level of detail in a risk assessment should be proportionate to the risk and appropriate to the nature of the work. It goes on to say, insignificant risks can usually be ignored, as can risks arising from routine activities associated with life in general, unless the work activity compounds or significantly alters those risks. Now, what that means is, walking, standing, sitting, they're things that we do in life in general. But if, say, for example, we are physically controlling someone, restraining them, for want of a better word, then that movement, that walking, that standing, that sitting with them is actually, involved in the activity of restraint. And therefore, we have to risk assess that for things like slips, trips and falls, manual handling, those sort of things. It goes on to say your risk assessment should only include what you could reasonably be expected to know. You are not expected to anticipate unforeseeable risks. So again, sometimes, people say things like, well, what would happen if? Well, you only need to risk assess those things that are foreseeable. Now, to give you a really wild story on this, as an example, someone once said to me, well, what would you do if you were sat in a chair? And I swear to you, this is a true story. What would you do if you were sat in a chair and someone tied you to the chair with masking tape, so your hands and legs were tied, you had masking tape across your mouth, and someone was hitting you and assaulting you? And I just asked the question, is that really going to happen? Has it ever happened in the past? Is it foreseeably likely to happen? And they said, no. But, I said, no, I'm not going to deal with it, because it falls into that last paragraph there. So when people start to ask you these insignificant questions, the way to deal with that is to say, is it likely to happen? Now, this is a document. It's produced by the Trade Union Congress. It's a good document, so I'll download this and leave this by the video for you to look at. It's worth reading, so download it and read it, and it goes through what a risk assessment is, so it supports what we're doing on this online course. And I'm just going to scroll down here to suitable and sufficient, as it says here. Now, suitable and sufficient also means that the person doing the risk assessment must have suitable and sufficient knowledge, or is gaining that knowledge from people that have suitable and sufficient knowledge in that field, okay? So when you're working with your MDT, for example, your multidisciplinary team in a healthcare environment, then they would have an input into your risk assessment. And on that basis, by the way, if a multidisciplinary team or a management committee, for want of a better word, are looking into how you physically control a violent patient or service user, then in a converse way, they should invite the trainers onto that assessment process too. So you can see that in the first paragraph here, it states much what the HSE says, but I want to come up to this paragraph up here. And it says, the HSE's approved code of practice to the management regulations give advice on what is suitable and sufficient. It makes it clear that the method used has to be appropriate to the complexity of the work activities and risks involved, and that the risk assessment must enable the employer to identify and prioritize the measures that need to be taken. It also makes clear that once the risks are assessed and taken into account, insignificant risks can usually be ignored, as can risks arising from routine activities with life in general. etc. Same as what the HSE says. But also, just thinking about this, and in one of the examples on this course, I give the example of someone going in to clean a cage, a tiger's cage, I think it is. And so what they have to do to minimize the risk to the cleaner is move the tiger out of that cage into another area and lock a door so the tiger can't get to the person in the cage. And then you've got to risk assess the door to make sure that the door is locked and there's no failings in the door that would enable the tiger to escape. So let's look at this from, say, a sporting activity like a martial arts activity or a physical restraint activity. And let's use the example of mats as an example. So many organizations train on mats, and they'll do a risk assessment to say, well, we need to do a risk assessment to make sure the mats don't slip. But also they may have areas around the outside of the mat where the mat doesn't fill the room. So you've got floor areas around the outside of the mat and they'll put beading down. That's fine. They've addressed that risk. Now you also get additional risks when using mats. And again, I'm only using this as an example to highlight the point. Someone on mats in training shoes may actually have ankle roll. And there has been a case where someone tried to turn on a mat, and due to the nature of the sole on the shoe, it stuck to the mat. And when they turned, their body and their knees turned, but their feet stayed in place because they were stuck to the mat, and they suffered a knee injury, which they sued for. So when you're looking at the risks, you're saying, okay, we've got mats, but if people are training on those mats in shoes, we now have the additional risk of people wearing shoes on a mat. One of the ways that people get around this is to say, well, we'll take our shoes and socks, we'll take our shoes off and we'll train in socks. You now have an additional risk that you need to assess, is because someone in socks on a mat may slip. So you've got the increased risks of slips, trips and falls. So you have to look at the regulations in relation to that. So the control measure for that is, I know, let's take socks off and train on mats in bare feet. Now you have an additional risk in that because people training in bare feet on mats could pick up a foot infection. So issues around the cleanliness of the mats, how the mats are stored, how they're cleaned, how they're maintained, all of those things come into effect. So hopefully you can see how this is not just a one-dimensional view on doing a risk assessment. You've got to look at it from different levels of assessment, because each time you put a control measure in, that control measure in itself may actually give rise to another hazard that would need to be assessed out of your assessment. I hope that makes sense. And obviously when you're doing this, you need to go back to the appropriate regulations. So if you're doing a risk assessment under the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations, and you're doing a moving and handling thing, then you've got to refer to the manual handling regulations. If you use the mats example, like I just described, then you've got to look at contamination issues. If you're dealing with people in a confined space, then you've got the cost regulations. If you're using mechanical restraints, then you have the pure regulations, and you need to cross-reference in your risk assessment how you're complying with each of those different regulations if it is required in your assessment. So it sounds like a lot of work. It isn't a lot of work. You'll see how it unfolds as the course goes on, but I hope that makes sense, because your risk assessment is a really important document. So it's important that you put the effort in up front to make it a very strong document. Well, I hope that was of use to you. And like I said, if you've got any questions or comments, leave them below. If you like what you've seen and heard, please share it far and wide, and I'll speak to you all soon. Have a great day.